So the following is taken from a much longer talk that I gave on how I came to become a metaphysical idealist. But I wanted to cut this clip out to share it separately, primarily to get Fichte across to more people, because he's my guy. He's my main guy. I like a bit of Fichte. So, and it's also an argument that a lot of people haven't heard, and if they have heard it, they think is kind of ridiculous. So I wanted to set the record straight a bit on why it's good. Idealism, metaphysical idealism, if you're not aware, it's the idea that reality is in some way mind dependent. So it's not that ultimate reality is constituted of physical stuff and we are things within the world. It's that the physical stuff and the world around us is that which we experience. But yeah, without further ado. And I got that last piece of the puzzle when I was doing my PhD. And that's thanks to my main guy, my main man, Johann Fichte. He is who essentially, he was successful in putting the final straw on the camel's back, that was me falling down and accepting the truth and the reality and feeling the full force of idealism. And there were a couple of things that Fichte really helped me to understand and deal with. First is that I can stop thinking of the self and of my perception and my understanding, my being, my horizon of consciousness that brings things forth into my understanding, and I can stop thinking of it as a thing, as this kind of substance. I mean, I knew from Kant that, Kant kind of said it's a kind of transcendental presupposition, this unity of apperception, as he puts it. But for Fichte, he's more simple than that. He just says, no, you got to think of it as activity. It's not a thing, it's an activity, it's an acting. Gives force the idea that I can really recognize in myself now, if I focus on it, this idea that I recognize that even just in virtue of me existing right now and perceiving a world, something other than myself, there's some kind of will, some kind of acting going on. And Fichte really helped me to feel that, I suppose, and that kind of gels with this idea that reality is in some way constituted by my activity that brings reality in to myself and for myself. I don't know where I've got this impression from. I must have got it from somewhere, but I seem to remember that people don't really like Fichte's argument in the Foundations for the self-positing I based on the law of self-identity. I really like it. So it's essentially, the argument is essentially, oh God, can I remember it properly? So the argument is essentially, if we want to take something that we are not going to question, it's probably the law of self-identity. There's nothing more basic than that, arguably, in terms of propositions that we accept. Law of self-identity being A equals A. Can we deny that? I don't think anyone can really deny that. A equals A, B equals B. Things are self-identical. A thing is what it is and is not something else. That's the law of self-identity. And so Fichte starts with that, and he says, well, if we consider that as a proposition, what have we got? We've got A, and we've got an equals. This isn't how he puts it, by the way, but that's how I think about it. We've got an A, we've got an equals. What is the equals? What is it that, a bit like Hume with causation, he's looking at it and he's thinking, what is that? What is that in itself? What is it about that equals? Where is that located? What is it that gives me permission to insert that equal sign there? And he says, well, the only thing we've got at this point can be me, myself. I basically purely and simply affirm that A equals A. the act of positing something as being equal to itself, it must come from me. But then if we say that, we've presupposed a me. We've kind of gone back and said, oh, there's a me that's doing that, that's affirming that, that's giving that, that's saying or affirming that proposition is correct and that something is self-identical. And by the way, a quick aside here, I think one of the reasons people really don't like this is because they think he's just playing word games, proposition games. But he's really not, and this is what I'm saying, this is when stuff started to really click for me. We could think about it concretely. I'm looking at this fan right now, and what he's essentially saying with the A equals A, it's coming from me, is essentially saying, when I look at this fan, I'm saying it is this fan. Or, you know, my way of understanding that fan is as something self-identical. But in me making that judgment, I've got to recognise that it's me making that judgment. And so he's essentially providing another way of thinking about what Kant has already told us, which is that we play an active part in constituting what we're looking at. He's just doing it in this kind of way that's using a logical proposition. So that's why I think people don't like it, so they don't recognise that it has some hold on reality. You know, this Pepsi can, I'm looking at it, this is this Pepsi can. But that's me affirming that, and that's me making that judgment that it is. And he's saying that's built into our logic. So anyway, that's where he starts. A equals A. I'm the one making that judgment, but that's assumed an I. So what is an I? Well, at this point, all we've got is the law of self-identity. So what is the I? Well, we could just say I equals I. That's all we can really say. We don't have any justification for going any further than that right now. We're trying to restrict things to what we can say for definite. You know, what's built into the law of self-identity, what's built into my relation with the fan, what's built in to my relation with this can of Pepsi in front of me. What must we say about it if we're just restricting it to those very basics? Well, it's I, and I'm self-identical to I, so I equals I. So now we've gone from A equals A to I equals I. But then we have another equal sign in the middle. Well, how can I affirm that I equals I? Or rather, what is it where, the same question, you know, what is it that affirms that self-identity, that gives us that equal sign in the middle? Well, it can only be the I, just the same as it was with A equals A, fan equals fan, Pepsi can equals Pepsi can. The only thing that it can be is the I. And so where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us potentially with an infinite regress, because then, okay, so I've posited the I that posits that I equals I. And then that I that I've just posited, that's also going to be understood as self-identical. So we need another I, or we need to go further back. You know, it's going to end up in a infinite regress. Except that can't make sense. Can't just have an infinite regress of I's. That's kind of reductio. That's an absurd conclusion. So what must be the case? Well, what must be the case, the way Fichte puts it, is the I posits itself purely and simply. With A equals A, we can say that there's an I that is positing that A equals A, and that is asserting that A equals A, that is actively judging that A equals A. When it comes to the I, all that's there to do that judging, that affirming, is the I. And so essentially the way I think about it, I mean, he says it affirms itself purely and simply, or posits itself purely and simply. So the way I think of it is, instead of thinking we've got an I equals I, that's created two separate things. But we're not two separate things. Essentially, instead of doing an equals, we do a little arrow that leads back to itself. The reason we can't do that with A equals A, by the way, is because we know that the equals is something that we posit. You know, the A here and the A here. Use my hands as symbols. Right. Yeah, we got an A here and an A here. The equals between them. We know that It's not the A that's positing the A, because we're looking at the fan or the Pepsi can or whatever it is. That Pepsi can doesn't exist for me because it posits itself. That doesn't really make sense. So we know that in the case of A equals A, we're the ones doing the positing. And so it makes sense to have, the two things there with us in the middle. The most important part of the equation, the part that Fichte's trying to draw our attention to, is the equal sign in the middle, essentially. Because what he's drawing our attention to is that equal sign is just an act of affirmation, purely and simply, right? And, we purely and simply posit that the Pepsi can is equal to itself. And so when it comes to us, we posit purely and simply that we are ourselves, and that we exist. And in the case of the I, unlike in the case of A and A, Pepsi can and Pepsi can, fan and fan, unlike those, in the case of the I, we are the affirmation, the equal sign, the affirmation of self-identity is here. It's the I. So there's not this external I coming in and providing that affirmation and providing that judgment that something is self-identical. It is all here. And that's essentially what Fichte's pointing out, is he's saying this is all there is. But there is still the affirmation. So where does that affirmation go? It goes around back onto itself. And that's a good way of thinking about the self-positing I that Fichte thinks is the foundation. Essentially, we can't go any lower than that foundation when it comes to knowledge, because if you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, the affirmation I am, essentially, is what that is. And one might, and I do, I think, maybe I'm being too charitable to Descartes, but one might think that is what's meant by the cogito as well. I think, therefore I am, or I think I am, as he puts it elsewhere. It's essentially, it's just the recognition that I am. And contained within that is just this brute self-positing. There's no getting underneath that. Something else doesn't give that to me. I give that to myself. I know that I am. No one else could give that to me. Who or what could give me my own affirmation of myself as existing? And I think that's where my primary recognition of the truth of idealism comes from, because nothing else could give that to me. Not, to be specific, not the physical world. The physical world cannot give me my own affirmation. It doesn't make sense to say that could happen, because that's the foundation for me thinking and experiencing anything, including physicality, including the world that I experience around me, is this basic affirmation of existence. And it's not a conscious, like, I'm constantly thinking I am. It's there. It's always there. It's the precondition and the necessary condition for experiencing anything. That was the real start of my my buying into idealism fully, was thanks to that thought from Fichte. I mean, there's something else that he has made me realise as well, which is that the opposite way of thinking about things, the way that I just said, is impossible or doesn't work. This idea that I could come or be explained by something external to me, an ultimate reality of physical stuff, let's say. What Fichte points out is that way of viewing the world, or a way of viewing the world that views me as just a kind of externally caused thing, can be consistent. It can be completely consistent. I mean, Fichte liked Spinoza. He gave Spinoza as this kind of the pinnacle of that way of thinking that he doesn't agree with, but that can be completely consistent. In other words, Fichte says, you can come up with an entire way of understanding reality that is completely logically consistent and explains everything. You can be so airtight with it. But the problem with it is you leave out the I am, the affirmation, which means you leave out the self and consciousness. And people that have these systems, such as physicalism and materialism, if they work them out fully, they'll end up with an intellectually and logically coherent, consistent system, but they'll fail to account for consciousness. By that I mean they won't recognise what consciousness is. They won't recognise that it is so distinct. It's in the realm of A equals A. It's not in the realm of I. Everything is explained in terms of external causes. A causes, B causes C. And in those systems, the physicalist, materialist systems, what Fichte calls dogmatist systems, which is essentially anything that's not Kantian, not critical, those systems will all fail to account for consciousness, and they'll all be thinking of things as A, B, C, external things without any self-affirmation in there. And that means ultimately that the self is considered just another thing. And I think that's true. I do think that's true. I can't see any way of having any, in principle, any physicalist, materialist system, and to that end, nor can I see any way of having any kind of panpsychist system or anything like that. Anything that fails to recognise the true ground of subjectivity, which is essentially the idea that the world out there is essentially my world and our world. It's a world of experience that presupposes and requires an affirmation of, I don't know if you want to call it self, because that might load it too much, but requires this activity of experience and subjectivity at the base. Fichte did say that those systems can be completely logically consistent, but it misses out consciousness, and it misses out those things which we do tend to believe in, and that we want to believe in as well, such as freedom and morality. Because those things only make sense if we have real consciousness, real subjective will and activity. If we don't, then we're only ever butting our heads against the wall by trying to imbue such things in a world of things. As you can tell, I'm a bit worn out. This has gone on for much longer than I thought, but idealism's fun. I can't. When I got into the Fichte stuff, I couldn't help myself. Had to get invested in it. You know, it's much more exciting than materialism. Like, come on. It's just, yeah, materialism's boring. It's also not true. Be an idealist.